Listen, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm sorry we couldn't be in the beautiful city of Prague, but I guess this is the next best thing, and I've really enjoyed the fascinating presentations so far today. So I'd like to share with you some experiences from our organization, which is Radar. We're a very new organization. We're just 2 years old. We're a startup news agency. Can you see my screen now? Is that sharing okay?
Yes, we can see you. Yes.
Great, terrific. So as I said, we're a 2-year-old startup, although we partner with the PA, the Press Association, which is a 152-year-old, very well-established national news agency for the UK and Ireland. So our story is quite new, but within the context of a much longer story. I think today has been about new ideas relating to different challenges for journalism, and the ideas are all very different, and that's because the challenges are very different, and we're trying to set out to solve a very specific challenge. And I thought it might be worthwhile just starting with a little bit of background on that. So myself and Gary Rogers, who's my business partner, started Radar 2 years ago, and really we were trying to solve one very specific problem, which is we'd been working with and talking to many local news companies, newspapers, radio stations, websites, etc. And most of them were really struggling for a sustainable business model as their world turned digital. And I guess to boil that down in the simplest way possible, it's always been the case that journalism cost is pretty much fixed, whether you're sending a reporter to cover a national government or local city hall or a neighbourhood council. The cost is pretty much the same. If you send a reporter to cover a Champions League match or a local amateur football match, the cost is pretty much the same. So granular journalism, the cost of creating articles are pretty much a fixed unit. And that used to be compensated for by the fact that the more granular, the more local you got, the more greater proximity you had to the audience, you got a revenue reward for that. So you got better subscriptions, or you got more high value local advertising, or you created classified platforms. So in a print world, the more local you got, the better your revenue model got. So that was quite an attractive motivator to sustain local journalism. In a digital world, that's sort of collapsed, because certainly in the markets we were talking to in the UK and the US, most local media were largely dependent on the digital revenue on fairly commoditized programmatic advertising, which meant it didn't really matter which eyeballs they were sending to their websites. Therefore, they were motivated to find the biggest audience, which generally means a national one or even an international one rather than a very local one. So the outturn of that is an important one for the industry and for society, because you start getting news deserts, because it becomes uneconomic to cover some small local markets. You start getting bigger coverage footprints, so people will start reading statewide news rather than local news for them. And there's an increasing incentive to start putting off-patch content, so content from other parts of different markets into local websites. So that was the specific challenge we were trying to address, was how do you make the coverage, the allocation of journalistic resource to local stories attractive again? How do you make those economics stack up a bit better? So at the moment, a lot of publishers are stuck in this sort of corner on the left-hand side, where they're getting plenty of revenue because they're reaching lots and lots of eyeballs on a national or regional basis, but they don't want to get over to the right-hand side, because as that revenue becomes more fragmented and the cost remains the same, it becomes unprofitable to cover local and hyperlocal stories. So this is just a hypothetical model looking at the unit cost of creating one story. So our idea was, if you could actually blend that traditional journalistic human model with a much more scalable one, so the yellow line in here, where the marginal cost of adding in a new small geographical area was effectively zero, so you could go as local as you want, you could create the red line as a blended one, where actually it became attractive to produce news and produce journalism and particularly public service news and public interest news at a very local level. So that's what we've set out to do. And the solution that we've developed to do that is scaling up investigative data journalism. So effectively having a team of human reporters who undertake what is in a large sense, traditional data journalism. So finding really good, interesting data sets, data releases, and understanding those, finding insights from them and constructing stories and interviewing people and getting to the bottom of those issues. The difference is that we use automation and a tech stack to scale that up. So instead of doing it once, we do it hundreds of times for different local markets. So we launched Radar, which is an acronym for Reporters and Data and Robots, as a news agency. So we don't publish direct to the consumer. We sell our subscription to local newsrooms, so local newspapers, websites, radio stations, and so on. We've been doing that for 2 years. We've built that on a tech platform, which is effectively a workbench, which includes a data management system, has our own bespoke CMS, and then distributes those articles to hundreds of local newsrooms. As I said, we've been going for 2 years. We have a team of 5 reporters. They are people hired from local newspapers, so they're not tech people, they are journalists. And between them, they've produced almost 500,000 high quality front page news articles over that time. So we're producing, very, very high output of public interest news. And on average, our unit cost per article is about 1/20th of those local newsrooms' internal cost. So we're starting to create that yellow line where we can produce more and more articles at very, very low marginal costs. So we help those economics stack up to incentivize more local journalism. The way we work is on a weekly cycle. So we have a weekly conference where we look at what we've harvested and found out in the open data ecosystem, usually about 50 different data releases. We have a brainstorm among our journalists team, and we narrow those down to around 10 for a full investigation that week. So each reporter has usually 2 projects, and they're responsible for everything there, for cleaning up that data, for understanding it, for finding insights within analysing it, for interviewing the data provider, government minister, opposition minister, trade union people, campaign groups, charities, whoever might have a point of view on what that data means. And then instead of writing a story, they write an algorithm using natural language generation software, which allows that story to be flexed and reversioned for every row in the data, which will be, in our case, usually locations or location-specific institutions. Give you an example from this week. So it's just a fairly standard data release on the left-hand side, just hospital admission data, which came out on Monday. The rows in that data are hospitals in England, and the columns are just various different events, your number of admissions, reason for admission to hospital, and so on, demographic profile of people who've been admitted. So our reporter got that on Monday, spent Tuesday analysing the data, doing the interviews and so on, and on Wednesday released a story. So you can see a national version here, which is what a typical traditional news agency would do, one national story, where they found the best angle was around women and girls being admitted to hospital for abuse. But as well as writing that national story, Harriet, who's a reporter, also wrote an algorithm which found the best angle on that story and the best headline for that story and the best localized version for all 150 hospitals in England. And so by Wednesday, we delivered that national story, but also 150 local stories for local newspapers. You see the example for the Bolton News here. So we had 150 of those delivered at the same time as the national story. So we're using national data sets, applying human intelligence and traditional reporting and journalistic skills to those data sets, but we're using our automation to scale that up. So instead of 100 stories, typically on average, we produce about 400 versions per project. The whole process is very reporter-led. So as I said, our reporters have full ownership of each project. So they do about 2 a week. We've built this tech stack to allow them to effectively have a workbench to control that production process so they get the yields of the automation to get a much larger output than they traditionally would have. So I won't go into too much detail about the technology, but we've built our own DMS, which allows us to ingest and store and automatically generate some of the metadata. We then have a CMS, which allows us to create the project, develop the story, and then develop an algorithm in natural language generation, which can repurpose that story for every row in the data, which again will be a locality. We then have that CMS then starts outputting, so it starts generating those versions, it starts mapping them geographically so that we know where each relevant story should be located in the UK, and we can automatically generate images, charts, and we've experimented with video as well. And we then have an output from that which distributes the story. So if we create 400 stories, we have to match up those 400 with the correct customer, i.e. a newsroom. So the story you just saw about Bolton would be automatically delivered to the Bolton News. Nobody else would see that story and they would only see their story. So we have a web platform and an API version of that distribution. So if you are a local newsroom anywhere in England, whether you're a big city like Manchester or a small town, you'll receive about 10 stories per week, and you receive those in a searchable newswire. It's a very traditional looking product. It looks very much like the PA's newswire. The difference is the only stories that you see there are for your locality rather than being national or international news. And you'll see the themes there are typically around public interest topics, so the real traditional pillars of local news. So most of our stories are about crime, health, education, transport, housing, local government, etc. So they're very much around those core traditional local news pillars. And just to emphasize, this isn't a case where we're just sort of switching in different numbers for different localities. You know, quite often they will be completely different stories. So an example on the right hand side where we got some land use data. So you see the example there for Warwick is about urban growth on the green belt, so housing development going out into the rural areas outside the town. Whereas the version for Lewisham, which is a part of a neighbourhood in London, is about building on flood risk land, so where the land is actually below the flood risk levels. So we're not just substituting numbers in here, we're actually writing an algorithm that's sophisticated enough to find the best possible story within the data for each locality. So our output is typically, as I said, 2 stories a day, 10 a week, Monday to Friday. And that newswire is going to about 400 different local news outlets. So that's giving them each of those days, Monday to Friday, at least 2 really strong public interest stories that they can ingest into their digital product. And particularly for some of the smaller brands with smaller newsrooms, that's a very significant part of their overall product offering to their local audience. It also gives them a strong, again, public interest core to social media. So a lot of them have put a lot of resource into reaching out on social media, but unless they've got significant experienced journalistic resource on the ground, it's quite difficult to add high quality public interest journalism to that. So we're giving them that as a foundation that they can plan in and guarantee they know that they're going to receive every day. And then I guess the biggest surprise to us is, having started with a kind of model to address a digital issue, is that our content is really widely used back in the traditional print products as well. So we did quite a large data sample a while ago across a month, and found that the most common place by some margin to find one of our articles was on the front page. So we're giving a lot of daily newspapers sort of 2 or 3 front pages a week, and we're giving weekly newspapers 10-page leads through the early part of the book to really boost their overall content offering. And we're 2 years in, we've had terrific feedback from that. So I think the key things in this are the bottom left. It's good value. As I said, we're on average 1/20 of the cost of publishers and broadcasters producing this content. by themselves. On the top left, you can see, you know, we output a very large quantity of content, but most of our customers are using pretty much all of that content. So it's giving them a really large uptake in the uplift in the quantity of public interest news they have available. And I guess the most important thing for us on the bottom right is, you know, we're a national news agency using automation, but the general feedback we get is that you know, if there was a Turing test in this, that you can't tell that this is our copy rather than that written by a local reporter in the local newsroom. We get the tone of voice right, we get the flow of language right, and you know, it is to the right standard and right tone of voice for local news. Just a little bit of update. So we completely pivoted on the 16th of March, which was the lockdown date in the UK. We did two things. We started producing daily 2 new services. One was the number of cases in every local area, number of COVID cases, the other one was the number of COVID deaths. And we did quite a lot of work with the government departments to ensure we were explaining and communicating that very, very carefully and correctly for every local community. The second thing was we took our normal weekly editorial conference and we pivoted that towards COVID related themes. So our regular output of 10 projects per week became 20. Half of those were the new COVID ones, and the other half were predominantly about 80% COVID related themes. So we were looking at every aspect of the lockdown, you know, economic, social, what's happening to people's housing, you know, how many people have got garden space that they can use when they're socially distancing, what's happening to self-employed people, what's happening to the health service in terms of waiting lists and primary care and so on. So we really pivoted very quickly and very effectively into that space to really give every single local community that core information properly explained around cases and deaths, but also all the satellite issues around the crisis. And that's really, you know, significantly changed our whole engagement with the news industry. So you can see here that, you know, with some organic growth in the number of users, number of newsrooms using us, but most of the growth came in the number of articles per user that they were taking. So that grew almost 80% over the crisis period. So, you know, each newsroom is now using 80% more from us than they were pre-crisis. Now, some of that's down to them having to reduce their own internal resource because they've had to furlough or lose staff. So they're you know, the economics have hit them even harder. So our contribution, if you like, back into the content offering for local newsrooms has got much more significant over the period. So in total, we've more than doubled the usage we're getting in our subscriber base since the crisis started. So that's it, really. That's what we do. Some things we've learned is, you know, you can do this. It's possible to challenge what seem to be fairly deep-rooted economics, that you can actually make granular, more localized news economically viable if you can find a blended model that takes traditional human journalism as our subscribers operate, and you complement that with scaled journalism from a central source. Then you can drive down the average price of very local content, and that means that you can make it profitable and therefore something that's sustainable over time by independent publishers. The most important and striking thing we've learned is that humans are really good at journalism and machines are not. And maybe machines will be someday, but that's quite a long way out. We've created, ironically, a very human-driven workflow because we've found that reporters are much better than robots or machines or algorithms at finding interesting data sources and sniffing them out. They're definitely much better at working out what the story might be within that data. And sometimes that's hidden away on tab 99 on column J. and there's one little item in there that just has a particular resonance and is the basis of a really good story. And this is maybe the one that will be challenged more short term, is that they're still better at writing it in a compelling way. And obviously there are tools emerging that might challenge that a little bit. But at the moment, we've found that humans are really good at those things. So we've really found, a good recipe in having a human-driven process, but one where we've applied automation to help them scale that up massively. So that takes an awful lot of extra skill and training from them to be able to change their mindset from writing a 500-word article to writing a fairly complex algorithm that can then output something between 400 and 600 words for 400 different localities. But once you get that right, it's a terrific boon. So for our reporters, they go home from work at the end of the day, or stay at home at work at the end of the day, as they do now, I suppose. And instead of having one byline, they've got 500. They've got their coverage in local newspapers, local websites, radio stations, national newspapers across the country. So we've really helped them to leverage their reporting skills. Thank you.